I would like to introduce Diana Campbell-Betancourt, who will be chairing this discussion. Diana is one of our APT9 interlocutors, someone who lives a truly trans-regional existence. She fondly describes as living her life on a plane. A great friend of ours here at QAGOMA, and who has been working in South and Southeast Asia for the past 10 years, simultaneously running a wide range of other curatorial projects around the world. Diana is the founding artistic director of the Dakar-based Samdani Art Foundation and is chief curator of the Dakar Arts Summit, alongside other projects. Diana is joined by an esteemed group of curators, academics and artists and friends, which I'll let her introduce, and we can join this session. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tarun and QAGOMA, for having us here, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. So for this panel discussion, we're going to shift our focus further east to look more at Asia, but the Europe part of this will come up as well, because I think something that we all have in common is there's a lack of local funding, so a lot of us have to look to European sources of funding to realize our projects. And I think something that Nav talked about was this idea for culture to be able to override geopolitics. That's something that is dear to all of us as well. So the title of this panel is Conditions of Contemporary Art in Spaces of Trans-Regionality. And in the introductory sentence, it talks about the Asia-Pacific as being framed across geographic subregions, delineated across certain political, cultural, and ethnic lines. All of us on this panel, and most people in general, can't define themselves within colonial or geopolitically defined regional terms. These terms are usually externally imposed, and I wanted to bring up a context, or an example of the context where I work in Bangladesh. From the period of 1947 to 1971, Bangladesh was a de facto colony of Pakistan because when the British split up the region, they united Pakistan and Bangladesh despite at least a 3-hour time difference between the two on religious lines, ignoring the plurality that's found culturally in worship. So I bring this up because there's been a question of religion coming up in a lot of these talks over the weekend, and I think that considering the plurality that's found across religious lines is really important. So you all have everyone's bios in your panel, but I thought I'd give a little bit of color to each speaker before we get into the discussion. So from my end, speaking about transregionality, I'm American. I live in Bangladesh and Belgium. My mother is of indigenous Chamorro origin from Guam. My first language was Spanish. So my cultural influences can't really be defined in one regional box. Dr. Munira Al-Qadiri is Kuwaiti, but she was born in Dakar, Senegal, so sometimes she gets labeled as a Senegalese artist. She was educated in Tokyo and is fluent in Japanese. And when we look at kind of streams of transregional funding, there's a term MENASA, Middle East, South Asia, North Africa and South Asia that's used, but there's not really a term, I guess what would it be, MENASIA, which brings in East Asia. Yeah. Outside of things like APT, Fukuoka, and to a much lesser extent the Dakar Art Summit, it's hard for these Asias to talk to each other, so we'll speak about that in a bit more detail. Dr. Greg Dvorak is an American, but he grew up in the Marshall Islands, and he's deeply invested in the culture, art, and discourse of a place that he called home. He currently calls Japan home, where he teaches and researches Japanese and American post-colonial histories in Oceania. His book, which will soon be available in the QAGOMA gift shop, Between Coral and Concrete, Remembering the Kwajalein Atoll Between Japan, America, and the Marshall Islands, is soon coming out. And as we could see in the questions during the book launch, there was a question that was asking about kind of why everyone was European on the panel. But something that I think is interesting with Greg's research is that the American influence in the Marshall Islands is very visible because of the power of these images of the nuclear testing. But the much more subtle Japanese imperial influence isn't something that's discussed so widely. So we'll get into that in more detail. My oceanic brother, Leuli, is an artist, curator, and writer of Samoan, Iranian, and other ancestries, and he recently earned a PhD at Monash University. His important work seeks to connect over a sea of islands across the Great Ocean, a space that's often at odds with the idea of nation. And there's little to no funding for art and culture within Oceania, so he'll also speak to how he taps into other sources to fuel a new network. And last but not least, Siddhartha Perez is a curator at the National University of Singapore and a co-founder of Planting Rice in the Philippines, which is an interdependent platform promoting cross-pollination of ideas, resources, and practices that happen between artistic individuals and communities. She and her institution work to challenge and complicate nation-building narratives that are found in simplistic definitions in terms such as Southeast Asia. And before we jump into this discussion, I wanted to acknowledge the incredible role that Australia has played in catalyzing all of our transnational work, from us being here in the first place, but also examples such as APT's commissioning of Munira's work, which you see on the third floor. It was a long-standing idea, and APT is what brought that to reality. Funding the research for Greg's book, funding Leili's travel and participation in the Sovereign Words writing program at the Dhaka Art Summit, and also and Norway, both of them, and also bringing Sid here to be part of this discussion. So, without any further ado, let's start with the first question, which I'll first address to Sid. What new transnational or transregional perspectives do you see developing across Australia, Asia, and the Pacific? And we had discussed earlier that, within your institution, you're seeing initiatives coming from artist-led groups to kind of reinscribe connections that predate the colonial era. If you could talk a bit more about that, it would be great.
At the moment, it's difficult for us to think about terms that define us, especially where we are based and where we are living. And it has always been a question of mobility and access for the last, 5 years, 10 years. However, it's always been an issue. But we consider then that before this contemporary period that we're in, that certain mobilities have been a lot more, have been happening a lot more than we think at the moment, just because of the data that we have public access to. The things that we find connections to are how certain artists in the region, they also support and collaborate in building artistic ecologies. The idea of collective and communities are slowly being redefined. They are looked at more as societies rather than groups. For instance, just an example of a prep room project that we are doing with Patani Art Space. It's an initiative by this group of artists who set up their own kind of community and ecology, also through the help of somebody from Jakai, who's also exhibiting here at the APT at the moment, and to think about how they are constantly hijacked as just like the Muslim South, and all the terms that define and characterize like the violence in the South. But then there has to be something more than that. And with that agency, through their collaboration with different artists, communities, not direct funding from different institutions, they have a lot more freedom to test new things, complicate things, to find out what it means for them to revive, let's say, also a problematic term called Nusantara, for instance, and what is Malay, what is Malaya. So these are the questions that are floating about at the moment with that example.
Fantastic. Maybe since you're talking about artists, we can move to the artist perspective. Munira, what new trends are you seeing?
Where exactly?
Well, I guess, good question.
I would say in the Arab-speaking world right now, we are living in a very abysmal moment in terms of geopolitics and cultural production in general. There is a new level of kind of oppression and censorship, and also kind of utilizing artists as kind of PR tools for the state that didn't exist before. Things were more kind of informally happening. So there is a kind of a general kind of feeling of malaise and rejection from society. So many artists that I know are kind of fleeing to Europe now, which is a sad situation to be in, including myself. I recently moved to Berlin. Yeah, this is the situation right now. I don't know how to describe it in more kind of active, positive, creative terms. But yeah, you all watch the news and you know what's happening. So I don't know what's going to happen from here. Obviously, we've created networks together and we collaborate and work together, but the malaise is there. So I don't know how to, the work is very dystopian, very nostalgic, tragic, and sometimes futuristic, but not in a kind of positive way. So that's my answer to this as the perspective of an artist. Yeah.
Okay, Greg?
Well, I think people are needing to move in different kinds of channels, but my base, I guess, in terms of how I connect with APT is trying to focus on other parts of the so-called Pacific that haven't been involved as much in this endeavor. And there's a scholar named Matt Matsuda who wrote a book, Pacific Worlds. He describes the Pacific as being translocal. In fact, that's his definition of Pacific, that it's all about translocalism. And I think this idea of region is something that, when we impose it from the outside, from the Pacific Rim, looking inward, and the rim, by the way, is the outside, it's not the inside, then, it's quite easy to come up with a million different, I said this last year actually here as well. You could have at least 10 different Pacifics, and I could say the same about Asia. So how do we hack that? How do we hijack that? As scholars, as curators, as artists, I think also has to do with looking to the past. You talk about sort of a dystopian future, but looking at these roots of indigeneity. I mean, I've thought it's been very moving to be a part of the opening of APT, to see just the welcome to country and seeing how these connections that really have always been there are being revitalized and revisited and re-understood. So migrations, movements, translocal kind of connections, I think that the knowledge is already there. So it's kind of reactivating that, really, and art has a space to do that. But the funding might not be there. That's the thing. So how do you get into that?
Yeah, we'll go into that in the next question. Leuli?
I would say that I'm seeing a lot of work made in customary forms, but these are continuing or they're revived. In my lifetime, a number of art forms have been revived around here, the possum skin cloaks, the kangaroo skin cloaks, to weaving practices that are represented within the triennial and further afield, but also a lot of work made in media. So VR, increasingly film, because it can travel really easily. And I think a lot of intellectual labor from all different perspectives and happening in different languages, but primarily in English because of the nature of the linguistic colonization of this great ocean, to reacquaint ourselves with our histories outside of a European prism and outside of a fatalistic Anthropocene, towards more positive, or at least mitigated positive futures.
Okay, cool. Well, a word that you used, Greg, that I really, I guess we've all thought about since we had our private discussion, is this word hack. And, other than Singapore and Australia, where you guys are based part-time, many of us, or when you're also working in Oceania or the Philippines or the Marshall Islands or Kuwait or Bangladesh, there is little to no national funding to facilitate transnational exchange within these contexts or from these home perspectives. So how do you hack into and transform the opportunities at other funding arenas, such as the European ones? How do you hack into these to support your creative work without becoming a vehicle for soft power with politics that you might not necessarily believe in? And I kind of want to start with Greg, because Greg, you've also talked about how some of your research has been hacked by national interests when taken out of context. So I think you could answer that, or you could address this from two very interesting perspectives.
Yeah, I see the hacking part as the subversive part. I don't know I think it's been co-opted by, appropriated by.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to sort of call out maybe Australia a little bit in the process of my coming to Australia as a PhD student, and my own creative process also. I was actually making a film in the beginning and trying to get funding for all these different things. I was very grateful, and still am very grateful to how Australia funded so much of this, and yet I had never been involved with Australia. So I was kind of dealing with this thing called Australia, not understanding it, not understanding what was going on. But Australia instigated in me in all these different kinds of tensions and kind of border issues, both literal and figurative, about, wow, look, this reminds me of my childhood in the Marshall Islands. As an American kid, you know, self-reflexively thinking about what that entailed, being in this little island where Marshall Islanders were disallowed from being on their own land because Americans wanted to test intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so militarism, region and so forth, but I began to look more and more at those stories that had been disallowed, particularly the Marshallese stories, but also the Japanese stories and so forth. And so as I got into that, I discovered that there was a great interest in Japan about recovering those stories. So I became very excited about pushing my work into that direction and amplifying this Japanese story that hadn't been told. And looking also at people who had, under Japanese imperialism, been completely marginalized. Of course, indigenous people, but also Korean laborers, forced laborers, for example, comfort women, that sort of thing. And in so doing, I discovered that I was also becoming a mouthpiece for the Japanese right wing, without even knowing this. And in time, people would show up to my talks in Tokyo, and you've been there, so we're also having this conversation in Japanese, by the way. So, you know, this kind of strange space of, wow, maybe what I'm doing, I'm getting all this funding, and it's great, but how do you take Australian funding and then also Japanese funding, and indeed American funding, and then kind of make sense out of that in a way that is kind of friendly and maybe not too confrontational, because you don't want to get that cut. Those have been difficult. I don't think I have an answer, but I think it's been a part of my growing process as an intellectual person, a public intellectual, I guess, and someone who's working in those kinds of spheres. But that there's a danger. I've had to very clearly draw boundaries and learn from my mistakes. And I think that's self-reflexivity, positionality is a really big one. And I think it comes kind of with the territory, so to speak, of being someone who is marginalized perpetually, intersectionally, in all different kinds of ways. People know that that's a factor. And when they're not, when you're in a strong position of privilege, it doesn't even come up. So there are people that are hanging out in Europe without thinking about any of these issues, perhaps, in the United States, in positions of power, who don't have to deal with that. I find it to be an advantage, actually, that I'm constantly having to deal with repositioning myself. But then again, I'm a white man. Yeah, I mean, look, that's a thing. So I think there are other people that deal with this in different ways. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, good answer. So maybe continuing with the Pacific, we can move, Leuli, I know that you also deal with this balance in your work as well, or trying to find this balance.
Yeah, I was also thinking, as you were speaking, about the conflict between Taiwan and China that's playing out in soft diplomacy across the Great Ocean, particularly the participation of Taiwanese indigenous nation artists from various nations in Taiwan at the Festival of Pacific Arts every 4 years, increasingly since at least the Solomon Islands edition a few years ago. And we had a Bunun Nation curator with us in the Critical Writing Ensemble in Bangladesh, funded by Norway. I was funded, my participation was funded by Norway. And I think it's very interesting for us to kind of break some of these ideas. And some of my colleagues, including Lara Lopesi, have spent a lot of time with communities in Taiwan where we are ancestrally related, but kind of parallel to these European anthropological migration stories that they like to tell about us. So, yeah, I think it's becoming really intense, particularly in the Samoan context, where on one side there's deprivation, dependence, aid from the United States on the American Samoan colonized side, and on the supposed independent side, huge indebtment to China and vast buildings that we don't need, and white elephant sporting facilities for the South Pacific Games a few years ago. So I think that's some kind of a big conflict that's happening and in the last few weeks, Australia is reacting by reopening television and broadcasting services to the Pacific that were cut 4 years ago. And so there were, lots of different editions in Tokpisi and in French, and addressing a lot of the context, and then suddenly, we need them again to combat China. But if you look around the region, a lot of us are also Chinese. So from the 1800s migration, so it becomes really complex.
No, definitely. And something like you mentioned the Taiwanese participation in the Dhaka Art Summit, that came through the lens of indigeneity, but there's something that hasn't been publicized, but the Chinese embassy censored the recent Asian Art Biennial and made them remove all Taiwanese participation. So it's really interesting to see Taiwan as this point of contention here.
I think also here, Australian art institutions have been able to position art practice and knowledges from West Papua in a way that is never allowed, to my knowledge, in Indonesia. Even though a lot of artists and intellectuals there support perhaps the right of indigenous peoples to sovereignty and self-determination, it's definitely something that from Australia you can do in an art institution, but that the government will refuse to accept more refugees or at all treat them humanely.
Interesting. Sid?
There was a very provisional kind of conversation I've been having as to why there was a lack of funding for Filipino artists. This probably happened, this was just a couple of years ago, I'm not sure how it is now. Like definitely there are other channels of funding, such as private patronage, and what you could do to really shape like an institution's ethics and also economic flow. But we were thinking about this in terms of this is what we call like the colonial guilt that was being pumped back to past colonies, right? And how come Filipino artists weren't getting as much, let's say, from as the same way that our neighbors from, let's say, Indonesia, for instance. This was just a conversation that I remember, and we were then starting to think about how, when within the formation of the global South, Philippines was not part of it. So we were still living that kind of consequential, that was the aftermath, like economically in that global sense. This is why right now we're being left behind. But of course, it's a lot more complex than that. But we can see, we could define where the channels of funding are coming from and are more interested in aligning or bestowing this. So that's a question that we're all thinking about. Like, is it within that post-Cold War period that we're still thinking through our relationship economically with these different blocks?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to go back to Japan, sorry, because when I was a student there and very young student, and I needed support, I had a strange opportunity to sustain myself financially by being on Japanese TV in a TV show called This Is What's Strange About You Japanese People. And it was basically 100 foreigners from different countries. Many of them were born and bred in Japan and never had like half Japanese and had never been to the home countries of their parents, but because they looked different, were classified as kind of zoo animals. And we would just sit there and say very vulgar things about Japan, and everybody would cheer. And so it was a very strange time. I don't know what that was. I mean, really, it was just positioning. I don't know what I was positioning myself as a strange alien creature that people point at. what is that? So, and then my professor at art school said, stop doing this. This is not good for you. So then that was a good guidance that I got. Sorry to veer off conversation, but yeah.
Except if I can add something to that. I mean, I think actually you're reminding me that part of my own experience has been positioning myself in opposition to that kind of exoticization in Japan as a minority there. So I may be white man, but I'm like weird in Japan. Well, I'm weird anywhere, but so
Exactly.
it was always this kind of this optic of otherness that has actually enabled me in some ways to really experiment. Like kind of under the radar in a way. That people sort of like, well, you know, you're different, so you can say what you want.
Yeah.
And I think in these spaces of otherness, there is some, you know, getting back to the subaltern maybe, that there's a bit of this kind of speaking that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a kid, it's tough, but when you grow up, you realize that there's a lot of freedom in that space. So maybe continuing with you, taking the question, but to another, or at another angle. So something that I thought was really interesting when we were talking about funding was, you know, this idea, like, so your piece on the third floor was something that you had in your mind for a really long time, and you couldn't find support in the region. It was meeting the Kwaigoma team that helped you get the initial funding, but in a way, that partnership helped catalyze other funding within the region.
Yes.
So I guess the wider question would be, you know, I'd love for you to speak about that example, but how are, you know, new solidarities being creative, and do you see room for developing homegrown patronage, or also other forms of creating self-reliant resources within the region for art and culture?
So, yeah, I mean, the project itself was, on paper, I think regionally sounded a bit off. Women's synchronized swimming in oil, and it just, I think on paper it just sounded really wrong, and people really didn't understand what I wanted to do. And funnily enough, I think here they understood what I wanted to create, and I think this kind of stamp that this has been approved somehow makes it easier to put some funding towards a project that's already happening anyway. So that really helped a lot. But I mean, regionally, our kind of infrastructure for funding the arts in general is quite poor. There's 3 or 4 maybe places that help artists create new works or commission new works, because I think it's still largely seen of as a commercial endeavor. So if you're an artist, you make work and you sell it, and that's how you create. But if you want to create a site-specific installation or intervention or things that are not kind of traditional in the artistic sense, in a kind of modern way, it's very difficult still to be able to realize that. So, but yeah, I have to say, it's a lot of artists in Arab countries get their funding from European institutions, American institutions. And it's quite, I mean, sometimes it's the only opportunity that you have. And it's liberating and limiting at the same time. And also, regionally, if you want to get funding, obviously there's also the political baggage that comes with that. There's only so many things you can do. Because of the way that society and politics and religion is structured as well. So it's always kind of this tricky maneuvering and what you can get away with, and really having to think very creatively how to kind of deceive people sometimes.
The oil slick.
Into helping you realize your work. Yeah.
Excellent. Greg?
Well, I've been involved to some degree with the really exciting project of bringing Marshallese clothing mat weavers, Czechia project, to this APT, or at least helping to make some introductions, and also getting to witness Kathy Jetno-Kitchener's debut in this triennial space, and it's been really exciting. And I think it's to speak of artists from the Marshall Islands is a new thing. I mean, it's not that they haven't been there, but the actual naming and getting back to some almost facile questions of what is an artist. There is a process of authentication, I guess, that's kind of unfortunate. But the fact that that's happening, and then that wonderful group of the Women's Wealth artists from Bougainville and Papua New Guinea raising their tensions, and together with artist Taloi Havini, I think is really key in that kind of collaboration and bringing them into that spotlight, not necessarily to spotlight them, but for them to sort of see themselves in that space and say, well, you know, okay, you call me an artist, all right, you know, that's interesting. And to kind of grapple with that, but then also notice that that also creates a new platform for talking about things that may have been a little bit, what's the word? Uncomfortable or less comfortable to talk about in another sort of sphere. So I don't want to speak on behalf of Kathy, but I know that we've been talking about how being an environmental activist, a climate change activist, is a really important thing that matters very much to her, I believe. You know, it's very key to her career, but she's also an artist. And to have that space to be an artist and to speak more openly and freely is something that I think she's increasingly able to do in these kinds of spaces. And you know, the APT is certainly behind that.
Sid? Well, I want to acknowledge like all the work that's been done in a very invisible manner between artists, between curators, between collaborators, maybe between friends. It's interesting that there has been this whole discourse about friendship or network, you know, kind of building each other's practices. But what are the ways where we don't have to capitalize on that? There's also dangers to using this trajectory of like friendship. But at the moment, like what I've seen, like for example, when I was with Lino at Sasa Art Projects, for instance, there are new models being done or being thought about, even in Patani Art Space. What are the models of funding that addresses both immediate needs, like such as, of course, survival, and then also sustainability. Like people are starting to see that these two things are, there has to be a different way to merge it. And then an interesting kind of trend that I see is that there are several generations already involved in these initiatives. Even for Martha Atienza's Para sa Aton, for instance, like really what could art do, like a small initiative and to bring together different communities, like communities of women, of the youth. Actually, I don't like saying the word communities, because communities is more of people with shared values. I want to talk about them more as societies, where there are different, divergent, and very complicated ideologies coming together and trying to see how things could work out. And these are some very provisional, I guess, examples. These are the people that I work with and are very good friends with, where there has been ways where institutions are very hegemonic, kind of capital is not accessible, hence something else kind of comes out of it. You know, another way, another model. It's being shaped at the moment, I feel, but there is this network. There's also a re-examination of friendship, of societies, of living with one another.
Totally. I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that's something that I'm also seeing increasingly in India and also in Bangladesh, and it's a way to kind of counter these, like you said, hegemonic institutions that a lot of artists can't access. And I think the intergenerational support is also quite interesting as well. Yeah, Leuli, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Personally, I've benefited from a lot of residencies in Canada and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that in some ways are lacking here, and that definitely are lacking in my home archipelago, if you're not going to make art for NGO uses. Human Development Index related art, or art, you know. And I was also thinking about when an artist is accepted as Australian, the ability to broach subjects that are taboo in their home territory. So particularly Hazara artists in this country, Kurdish artists in this country, and Hoda Afshar, who's Afshari and Kurdish. Her incredible work remain as part of Primavera right now at Museum of Contemporary Art, Sydney. That I don't really know how that could ever be shown in Iran. Even. And actually, if, you know, a lot of these kind of sensitivities around work by First Nations artists from this continent, within this continent, and so then being able to bypass those by exhibiting in Aotearoa, exhibiting in Hawaii, exhibiting in Kanaki, New Caledonia, in Canada, Taiwan, wherever it may be, and particularly the work that's happening in Office of Contemporary Art Norway in Oslo and Tromsø, I think is like they literally broach this conversation between West Papuan elders and artists and Taiwanese indigenous artists and elders, and it was just like over there. Okay, cool. And then of course Sami are in that circle as well.
And also Bangladeshi, since Nabil is the one doing that.
Absolutely,
Yeah. But no, it's amazing. But I think also there's certain individuals who really take this kind of agency to make this kind of transnational exchange happen. And I think, Katia Garcia Anton is definitely one of those people. Taking the conversation a little bit of a different direction. So we're all talking about all these international opportunities that we have. And often we've also mentioned how there's much more funds with these international opportunities than there are at home. How do we find a balance with the needed work that we need to do in our regional context with the kind of work that we're doing internationally? And how, I think there's also this push, or at least something I've seen in Bangladesh, this push to work to international standards, but these international standards are usually framed from a Western perspective. And one example I loved was yesterday in the talk that Munir and Ellie were talking about, there was an Australian writer that was writing about his time on a pearling ship, and Munira thinks it might have been referencing her grandfather. And the pearling ships brought musicians onto the ships as a form of pleasure and entertainment, whereas this Australian writer wrote that the singing was an affront to the human ear. So they're just, these differences in perspective. So I would love to hear kind of how you guys personally navigate this, and also how you think we can also catalyze more activity within the region and form, new forms of standards that aren't Western oriented.
My idea to do this is it's always there's always a kind of limit of the work if the funding comes from elsewhere, is that I have to translate the work. And I really try not to do that. I don't want to translate my work. So if I will do a theater performance in Arabic, I will do it in Arabic, and you will have to read subtitles. So I think this kind of aversion to translation is something that I do purposefully, because otherwise I wouldn't translate the work. It's a simple strategy that I have.
Well, this word Western is what I've been kind of sitting here thinking about, because I'm not really in a so-called Western space. Japan is another hegemony.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So is Taiwan, really, and China, and the Taiwan-China thing, and how, with often very good intentions, even with Taiwan, those stories of indigenous Austronesian people are being mobilized as a way for Taiwan to do checkbook diplomacy, just like other places do theirs. I mean, it's clever. And I've spoken with, I'm sure there are people in this room that are more knowledgeable about this than I am, but indigenous Taiwanese who say, well, at least our stories get highlighted and we have some, again, hacking that we can do.
Yeah.
Better than nothing. But, in my space, I'm working towards trying to curate or attract at least art from the Pacific region, or from Pacific-minded Oceanian artists into Japan. And in doing that, I have to sell that sort of to Japanese interests, which are few. They don't get Oceania. They don't. The connections with the Pacific are there. They should be there, but they're often completely forgotten, and sometimes deliberately. And American empire has a lot to do with that, actually, and the Pacific War has a lot to do with that. And they're very fraught, very strange kind of taboos about things that cannot be discussed. So the issue of, I guess, translation also gets into this, and sort of how do you sort of interpret and position these kinds of connections. But locally, my heart is in the Marshall Islands and thinking about, well, how does that work? But then in those spaces, then I'm also having to speak with chiefs who want to be very covetous about particular work, and traditional leaders who will say, no, you can't make this work, or you can't exhibit that work, you can't do that. Why are you trying to do art in Australia or something like that? And those are other things that need to be called out. You know, I mean, these are like these interesting power fault lines. And that gets me back to the sort of translocal, that between Tokyo or some suburban part of Japan or the countryside and some locality deep in Samoa, I mean, there are these kinds of connections. And those things need to be sort of brought out. And in that space, I think there's a lot of there's space for really fruitful dialogue. But then to get the national attention and the funding, of course, you have to play some other games.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I guess redefining the terms of also what international is, what is Western, does it mean imperialistic, is it colonial, and what is colonialism too? It's not just the West.
Or let's talk about climate
Yeah.
control standards. So I had a friend in the Philippines who was a lender of a Juan Luna painting, and there's Western climate control standards in the National Gallery of Singapore. So if the work goes there and comes back, it's shocked.
Yes.
So, you know, that's more what I meant when I said Western.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But I still feel that the term needs to be redefined still. I mean, maybe that is a very pragmatic kind of definition to that. But we also have to consider that institutions who move or who act as platforms that generate these kinds of conversations and coming together are also, you know, they are aware and they are sensitive. They are learning to be sensitive in terms of languages and representation. And we are also actors as, you know, agents, as curators and artists who have a sense of each other's backgrounds and what are the things that we could pinpoint. Like, for example, you, Diana, like you knew what to kind of extract from us. You have an idea where we're from, what's the kind of cultural climate that we are navigating through. So I think this is, I really don't have a lot much to say, but these are the conditions that we are all aware of and trying to make sense together. And I think it is happening. Yeah.
I think there's a deep reflection in Indigenous communities from the lands and waters called Australia and neighboring territories around our ancestral relationships and how we activate these whilst leveraging Australia Council or state funding body or city-based funding or our own savings for projects. And I live in Naarm in the Great Bay of Melbourne and Kulin Nation territory, and it has the best arts policy in this country with like a sizable contribution towards all levels of arts infrastructure, and particularly on First Peoples. Different institutions there are doing a lot of re-envisaging of their futures and presents. But as people from the Pacific living across Australia, we have our best relationships with this institution, not the ones in our cities, necessarily. So, I mean, that's a subjective statement. But I was also thinking about that this is now international between us in this room, between Indigenous peoples of the same nation state, because you're crossing into another territory. And that something like the ghost I wanted to bring up was how Taiwan places a Han Taiwanese artist as the Tuvalu Pavilion in Venice for the last number of years. And there's never a reflection. It's curated by the same European background curator for the last few years as well. And I don't really understand why Tuvaluan artists, of which there are many living in the islands and in the diaspora, have never been placed on that platform. And it's like better to have no presence from Oceania than to have that. Yeah, it's kind of but I don't know who you want to speak to in Taiwan to change that.
Well, I think that's a nice closing for our discussion on stage.